Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this AQA A-Level Religious Studies video. I'm Ben Waddle, and today we're looking at 10 and 15 mark questions. So we'll be talking through everything you need to do to secure the highest marks in your answers and therefore achieve an A-star grade in A-Level Religious Studies. Let's get started with a look at the 10 mark questions, which will always ask you to examine. And the command word examine means to explain and describe in detail. So what do we need to do in order to achieve the highest marks? Well, firstly, all of your knowledge needs to be accurate. Remember, with these 10 mark questions, you are being assessed on your knowledge and understanding. So all the information you're including needs to be correct. For example, you can't be referring to Richard Dawkins as a committed Catholic when he's actually a militant atheist. So make sure all your information is accurate. You also need to make sure that everything you're writing is relevant. So any information you're including needs to be fully focused on answering the question. Do not go off on a tangent and don't just include everything you can remember about the topic. Make sure that everything is fully focused on answering the exact question. You then need to make sure that you are fully developing your explanations. Remember, to examine means to explain and describe in detail. So make sure that you are elaborating, you are expanding, and that you are unpacking the key ideas. So I think a great way to think about this is to imagine an iceberg, and above the surface, you have got what the scholar thinks. So, for example, you might be writing that William James believed religious experiences should be judged based on their impact rather than their origins. So that is what the scholar thinks in terms of that is James's judgment, and that is the bit above the iceberg. So I would be including that in my answer. But in order to achieve the highest marks, I then need to go deeper. I need to then develop my explanation. I then need to elaborate in terms of why James actually believes that. So I would then be explaining the reason for his opinion. So in this case, I would be saying that this is because James was a pragmatist who believed in seeking practical solutions that work. So for James, the truth is whatever works in practice. So that is why he is interested in the impact that experience has in terms of how it transforms somebody's life, which I can see, rather than its origin. So as I say, in order to achieve the highest marks, you need to make sure that your explanations are fully developed. And that is where we go into detail. We are going deeper in terms of explaining not only what the scholar thinks, but then the reasons for their opinion. Now, you also need to make sure that you are including detailed and relevant evidence. So you need to be referring to books that the scholars have written, or if you're writing about Christianity, make sure you are including quotes from the Bible. And then that brings us to the fifth bullet point, which is that you need to be making your textual and scriptural references. So within every paragraph that you are writing, make sure you are referring to what scholars have said, or if you're writing about Christianity, to a quote from the Bible. If we then look at the next bullet point, it says there needs to be a diversity of views and different scholars. So all that means is your entire essay cannot be about one idea or just about one scholar. You need to be writing, I would recommend, 3 separate paragraphs, each one dedicated to explaining a key idea. So you want to have about 3 scholars in your answer, and you want to, as I say, make sure it is structured into 3 separate paragraphs so that you can then dedicate each paragraph to explaining a different key idea. And that leads us on to the final bullet points, that there needs to be clear and coherent presentation, as well as the precise use of your subject vocabulary. So make sure that you are planning your answer before you start writing. So then you can dedicate each paragraph to unpacking a key idea and explaining a scholar's opinions. So if we have a look at what that looks like in practice, here is a suggested structure for writing your 10 markers. As you can see, I think you should have 3 paragraphs, each one of them dedicated to explaining and describing a key idea. So make sure you plan what each one will be before you start writing your answer. And then within each paragraph, here are the key ingredients for achieving an A star. So make sure that every paragraph refers to a scholar and make sure you use their full name the first time you refer to them. You then need to be explaining their ideas, and you can develop that explanation by using examples and referring to books that they have written. So make sure you are quoting their original words and what they actually said. But remember, in order to achieve the highest marks, you then actually need to go deeper in terms of your explanation. So you then need to explain the reasons for their opinions. So, for example, with James, you're going to be explaining that he was a pragmatist. Or if you're writing about Aristotle, you'll be referring to the fact he was an empiricist. To give you one more example, if I'm talking about Richard Dawkins and his belief that religion is delusional, you could then develop that by saying, well, he is a militant atheist and he believes in epistemic imperialism. He believes if there's no empirical evidence for something, it shouldn't be taken seriously as a belief, because he wants to have that evidence before he will believe something. And of course, as we know, a lot of religion is about faith instead. And then one more key ingredient is that you are using keywords for that topic. And of course, you want to make sure you are spelling them correctly as well. So you would write, I would recommend 3 separate paragraphs, each one of them dedicated to a different key idea. And as I say, the key ingredients for each of those paragraphs is that you're naming a scholar, you're explaining their ideas, you're using examples. So again, if we think about religious experiences, you would be giving different case studies. For example, St. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. You'd be referring to books that the scholar's written, or if you're writing about Christianity, you'd be referring to quotes from the Bible. You would then be explaining the reasons behind the scholar's opinions in order to add that depth to your answer, and then you're including keywords as well. Let's have a look now, shall we, at our 15-mark questions. And remember, the command word for this question will always be to evaluate. And to evaluate means to explain and analyze both sides of the argument before reaching a fully justified conclusion. So what do we need to include in our 15 markers in order to achieve the highest marks? Well, first of all, you need to be writing a very well-focused response. So everything that you write and all the information you're including needs to be relevant, and it needs to be fully focused on evaluating the statement. So again, don't go off on a tangent and don't just write down everything you know about the topic. Make sure that every paragraph is linked back to the statement. So make sure that your answer is 100% focused on answering and indeed on attacking the question that has been set. In order to achieve the highest marks, we also need to include what's called perceptive discussion of the statement. So to be perceptive means to be original. So we want to see originality, we want to see flair, and we want to see insightful analysis. So do not just repeat the textbook. Do not just recite the textbook. You need to be going beyond the textbook in terms of including those original ideas. So that might be bringing in wider reading that you've done that not everybody else has done. So you're bringing in a scholar that not every other student knows about. Or it might be evidenced in the critical thinking that you're doing. So when you're making your critical judgments of what scholars have said, you're making some really insightful points in terms of whether they've made a strong argument, or actually their argument is fatally flawed. And another great way to develop your perceptive discussion is to be making synoptic links. And that is where you're bringing in scholars from elsewhere on the course, from other topics, or even from another paper, and you're then using them to add that critical analysis to your essay. So in terms of developing your perceptive discussion, they are the three things I'd like to see you doing. Number one is doing some wider reading that you can then summarize in a sentence and include in your answer. Number two is critical thinking, so you're really confident when it comes to that critical analysis in your essay. And then number three, synoptic linking, so you can bring in different scholars as part of your answer. The third bullet point is there needs to be an explanation of different scholars' views. So, of course, when you're evaluating the statement and you're explaining both sides, you want to be using scholars as part of that explanation. So you need to be explaining why would Wittgenstein agree, or why would Aristotle disagree. So make sure you are saying who the scholars are, and then you're fully explaining their opinions. But you don't just want to be explaining what the scholars have said. In order to achieve the highest marks, you then need to critically analyze their opinions as well. So don't just explain Wittgenstein's view and then explain Aquinas's view. You actually need to then make judgments about whether they're right or wrong. And again, this is where your perceptive discussion is really important, because this is where you're then making those original and insightful judgments. So you then need to say that Wittgenstein's argument is convincing because, or Aquinas's argument is incoherent because. And this is a great opportunity to bring in other scholars, so to make those synoptic links and actually compare and say, actually, Aquinas's position is exposed as flawed by the views of, and then bring in another scholar. So it's really important with your 15 markers that every paragraph doesn't just explain whether a scholar agrees or disagrees with the statement, but actually then makes a judgment about whether they're right or wrong. So have they made a strong argument? Is it a convincing and coherent explanation or not? So make sure that those critical judgments and that critical analysis is included in every paragraph. And that leads us actually to the next bullet point, that there are evaluative judgments that are fully justified. So I don't just want to see evaluation in the conclusion at the end when you're making your overall judgment. It needs to be throughout your essay. So in every paragraph, we want to see that critical analysis where you're making judgments about whether the scholar is right, whether there is a flaw in their argument, whether it's incoherent, whether it's clear, whether it's actually really convincing. And then finally, don't forget, there needs to be precise use of the subject vocabulary. So make sure you are using your key terms and that you are spelling them correctly. So yes, with these 15 markers, really important to focus on that perceptive discussion, that there is originality and insightful analysis. And as I say, that is particularly important with your evaluative judgments. So don't just repeat what the scholar has said, but then actually go further. You want to be linking it back to the question, and you want to be making a judgment about whether their perspective is convincing, whether their argument is successful, or actually it is flawed and weak. So if we have a look at how to structure these 15 markers now, I have put on this structure that there are going to be 6 paragraphs, but really, I would say that that is equivalent to 5, because paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 are only going to be mini paragraphs, because I would always start a 15 marker with a thesis statement, which is a 1-sentence summary of your conclusion. So you're actually going to start your essay by setting out in 1 sentence what your conclusion will be. So I would start with 1 sentence such as, this essay will ultimately conclude that, and then you're either going to be agreeing or disagreeing with the statement. So you need to set out at the start your 1-sentence summary of what your essay will be concluding. And that means that from the very first sentence, your essay has got a critical tone, which can then help to shape your critical analysis and lead to your clearly justified conclusion. So paragraph 2, which is our first main paragraph, is going to be our first agree argument. And within this paragraph, in order to secure an A star, we need to include these key ingredients. You need to be naming a scholar, you need to be fully explaining their opinion, and you need to be using evidence. So make sure you are quoting their original words, you're referring to a book that they've written, or if you are writing about Christianity, make sure you're bringing in a Bible quote. You then need to explain how that evidence is relevant to the argument being made. But remember, you're not just going to be explaining what the scholar has said. You then need to be critically analysing, and that needs to be in every paragraph. So I want to see those judgments. So Aquinas is right to argue this, or Wittgenstein's position is convincing because. And again, that's where we see your perceptive discussion, which means your examiner can be awarding you the highest marks. The fourth key ingredient I've put down here is that you are making links. Every paragraph needs to include links. You need to be linking back to the question. So you need to be using the language of the statement in every paragraph so that your answer is fully focused and that it is then able to be awarded level 5. Because remember, to get a level 5, it needs to be a very well-focused response. So you're going to have links back to the question, to your thesis statement, but then also see if you can include links to other topics and other scholars as well. So make sure that if you can, as part of your critical analysis, you're bringing in another scholar who would demonstrate that the argument you're explaining is flawed, for example. So Richard Dawkins is always a great one because he is very critical of anything to do with religion. So if you've just explained an idea from someone like Aquinas, for example, you know, it's great to then bring in someone like Dawkins, who is going to be very critical of that. Now, you need to repeat that formula and include those key ingredients in every paragraph that you are writing. So as you can see, all of your paragraphs need to include scholars. They need to then include explanations that are supported with evidence. There needs to be critical analysis, and always see if you can make those links. Make a link back to the statement, and also see if you can link in another scholar from elsewhere on the course as well. And my advice would be that you are including 2 agree arguments and 2 disagree arguments before, and this is very important, reaching your justified conclusion at the end. And you want to include a fully developed reason. So in conclusion, this essay has demonstrated that, and then you're going to say this is because. So make sure in your conclusion it's really clear as to whether you agree or disagree with the statement, and that you then explain why. Now, talking of explanations, it is really important that throughout your 50 marker, there is developed explanation. You want to be fully developing your explanations of the scholar's arguments. So in terms of what you need to be doing is, again, think of it as like an iceberg. You're going to be stating what they've said, but you then want to be elaborating on why. So you want to be going into detail about the reasons for their viewpoint. And of course, you're then going to use evidence. You might refer to a book that they've written, and also to examples as well in order to do that. And by evidence, what I mean is you're going to refer to books that they've written. You're going to quote from their books. You might also be referring to a quote from scripture if you're writing about Christianity. You're going to use examples and case studies. So, you know, I always come back to religious experiences, but it's a great example of how you can use case studies when you're talking about St. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, or, you know, Bernadette at Lourdes. So always bring in case studies to develop your explanations. But of course, remember that alongside your explanations of what the scholars believed, you need to then critically analyze them. So whereas with the 10 marker, we explain what they believed and why they believed it, for a 15 marker, we then go one step further, which is why it is worth more marks, because we then add in an evaluative judgment of their opinion. So we then as it says here, don't just explain what they've said. We then develop, a perceptive discussion of their ideas. And we do that by using a phrase such as, this is a strong argument because, I can't speak anymore. Best keep hydrated, guys. Very important when you're revising. This is a convincing argument because, this argument is successful because, and again, you can then link in another scholar. So you might know another scholar who says something very similar. So you could say it's a convincing argument because it is supported by, and then bring in another scholar who would back them up, because of course that then strengthens the credibility and demonstrates the success of that argument. But of course, you also want to be saying when you think an argument is quite weak. So this is a weak argument because, this argument is fatally flawed because, this is an ineffective argument because, or this argument is robustly challenged by. So as I say, the key difference for me between the 10 marks and the 15 marks is that whereas with the 10 marks, you're explaining what the scholars have said and why they've said that, for 15 marks, you are going one step further. You are adding in your evaluative judgments. You're then actually making judgments about their opinions. So you're not just explaining why they believe it, you're then making a judgment as to whether they're right to believe it. So is it a convincing argument? Is there support for what they're saying? Or actually, is it quite weak? And is it quite easy to undermine and criticize? So hopefully that's all been helpful. Please let me know if you've got any questions or you've got any advice on how to answer 10 and 15 mark questions. And I wish you every success with your studies and your revision. Thank you for watching and good luck. Bye-bye.